Hi, welcome everyone to our monthly Blue Goat Cyber webinar. Today we're going to be talking about the FDA cybersecurity requirements. Some of these requirements have really caught a lot of people off guard and has resulted in their submissions being delayed. So here at Blue Goat, we're on a mission to help raise the awareness with the cybersecurity requirements today with submissions. I'm here with Trevor. He's our CTO. He's going to be going through most of the slides. We have some slides to accommodate our webinar. And then as we go through, if you have any questions, feel free to type it in and it'll show up here on the screen. And at the end, you can also ask questions as well. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to you, Trevor, if you want to kick us off.
Yeah, thank you for that intro. So I'd like to just capture a little bit of what we're going to be going into here. We're looking at cybersecurity through that regulatory lens. So this is focused specifically on what you need to know as a regulatory affairs professional when you're going through the cybersecurity process, when you're working with the manufacturer to try to develop their device, how you're ensuring that they're ticking all the important items off as far as cybersecurity, as well as some of the common pitfalls that we see in our day-to-day business as cybersecurity professionals in the medtech space. All right, and with that, we can go ahead and get right into it. So the first thing that I really like to talk about when we're looking at this is medtech compared to traditional cybersecurity. I know that this is a common point that we bring up, but it's for good reason. This is very important to understand these distinctions. Medical cybersecurity is focused on some different regulations and different requirements that we aren't seeing in other industries. Cybersecurity can't be thought of as just one general industry. It varies greatly depending on the application. If you're in cybersecurity in the medical space, it's going to be a lot different compared to cybersecurity in the automotive space or just general network security. The regulations driving cybersecurity requirements are usually going to be for the regulatory body that is dictating how a device will get cleared. In the US, of course, it's the FDA. In Europe, it's the EU MDR. It's the MDFS in Korea. Everywhere has their own agency. Now, medical cybersecurity professionals are going to work very closely with regulatory affairs professionals. The outcomes of cybersecurity testing and cybersecurity documentation feed directly into the regulatory documentation that are required for an FDA submission. So compared to other industries where typically the cybersecurity professional or penetration tester is going to prepare a report or some deliverables, and then that is sent off for review to a detached team, there's usually going to be a lot more back and forth in this space. Now, regulations and guidance are driven by the FDA and largely their pre-market guidance document relating to cybersecurity. However, there are a lot of different standards and best practices across many different documents that are going to apply here. Some of the more common ones that we see are going to be IEC 62304 for secure development of a medical device software, ISO 13485 for quality systems in medical devices, and then getting into the testing specifics, we see NIST Special Publication 800-115 and ISO 27001 as the golden standards for cybersecurity testing in medical devices. Another way that medical cybersecurity is a little bit different as opposed to traditional cybersecurity is there's a lot more overlap with safety. And I think this is probably the biggest differentiator here. When we're looking at cybersecurity impact for a medical device, the worst outcome of a vulnerability is usually going to be patient harm, where if we're looking at a traditional network, it's going to be much more difficult to cause direct harm to an individual. It's more going to be around the focus of denial of availability or disclosure of sensitive information. While those are still sensitive areas in the medtech space, we're largely focused on how can we hurt someone or how can we violate HIPAA in the US or GDPR in the EU by disclosing sensitive information. The next thing that I want to touch up on is how we're handling risk management under FDA guidelines. So risk management is a broad term. It can't cover all areas of risk. Usually there are individual categories of risk that we need to cover. What we're going to be looking at is ISO 14971 for safety risk management and AAMI TIR57 for security risk management. So ISO 14971, many regulatory affairs professionals are going to be familiar with. This is the process for evaluating the risk to patient safety or to operator safety if there is a problem or a defect in a device. It is a standardized process where we're able to triage and assess different problems in the same way so that we can get reliable and easily reproducible results. Now, as we can assume, this is focused on that safety aspect and harm to an individual. We aren't focused on harm to the device or maybe harm to a network. We're looking at safety problems here. So it has a narrow scope, as risk management should. Now, one thing that's important to note about these two different risk management approaches is they're very, very similar. TIR57 is modeled heavily off of 14971. They have a very similar approach. They just have slight differences to work towards slightly different goals. Now, for TIR57, we are looking at security risk management. So how are we going to handle security within a product? How can we handle potential for data loss, potential for denial of availability, for confidentiality breach, integrity breach? This is what we're looking at here more in this regard. Now, it's important to note, as we had talked about on the last slide, that there is usually going to be a bit of overlap between security and safety in the medtech space. With that in mind, that's why TIR57 is modeled so closely off of 14971. They can tie together at that risk assessment phase. So if we're going through a cybersecurity problem that we've identified, we're analyzing it, we're trying to determine what that impact could be, and we identify that there is a potential for impact to patient safety. That's when we take the same problem and we're feeding it through that separate yet connected 14971 risk management framework. So this way we have two separate processes to handle two different areas to get to two different goals, but often these goals are going to coincide. And so we have a clearly defined process where these two intersect at the risk management phase so that we aren't potentially missing a safety or security vulnerability if we think it only applies to the other. All right, the next thing that I want to talk about a little bit is ISO 13485. This is a standard that defines how a quality management system should be set up and maintained for a medical device. This is very largely focused around the regulations. However, there are a lot of different areas that are going to feed into the requirements for this standard. When we're looking at what quality management system is, this is essentially all of the documentation, all of the processes, how we're maintaining a different history for each of these documents, and how we're collecting artifacts throughout the development of the device, throughout the development of internal procedures and policies, and maintaining them in a clean, easy to organize way. There are a wide range of different quality management systems that are commonly in use. Each one of them is usually just going to be structured so that we're able to organize all of the different standards, all of the different policies and procedures that we're following in an easy way, and something tailored to how we're going for a certain submission. In this case, we're focusing on FDA submissions. So everything in your QMS should be organized based on what you're expecting to see going through that E-Star submission, going through that FDA submission process. Now, one of the reasons that we're going to need a QMS is we want to ensure that design is consistent. Everything should follow a standardized procedure. We'll talk a little bit down the road here on what some of those standards are for secure and consistent medical device development. However, in general, we just need to know that there has to be a process in place to do things in a consistent manner. If development is done in an inconsistent way, which is very common, every developer has their own unique style or their unique way of doing things, then we can run into issues with having consistency across a product. Ensuring that we have clear coding standards in place, clear design specifications in place, allows for a team of different individuals to work together to create a consistent product. So when we're setting up a QMS, we need to make sure that everything is accounted for as far as the development practices, any standards that engineers should be using, and that is heavily enforced throughout the development lifecycle of the product. Now, one thing that we need to look at, of course, in the regulatory space, this is largely focused around compliance. Many different manufacturers will tout how they meet 13485 compliance, or contract engineers will tout how they design their artifacts or they design their product within compliance for 13485. Having this badge of approval saying that you are meeting all of these compliance requirements shows the FDA that you are doing your due diligence to create a secure and consistent product. Another part of this is it shows that you are continually reviewing the product that you are creating. Security, design, regulation is not a once and done process. It's a continuously evolving cycle, and it's something that we're going to have to address multiple times throughout the life cycle of a product. So having a secure QMS, it's making sure that we have the process in place, the procedures, it's all very easily reproducible, and it can constantly evolve. So if there's a need to review documentation, change an SOP, that should be built into the QMS as well. Now, to sort of summarize everything that we're doing with ISO 13485 here, we're looking at product safety, satisfaction, performance. This is through consistency. This is through traceable design. This is through traceable history of documentation and sufficient documentation. We always say that every engineer's worst nightmare is having to write documentation on their code. And while it can be tedious for many to prepare some of these artifacts, it is vital, especially in the regulatory space, when we need to present to the regulatory authority how we develop this product and all of the artifacts that are required to go along in that submission. All right, now we can talk about security by design. So security by design is essentially the mindset that we're building security into a product from the inception of the product. Security isn't something that we're trying to nail on at the end. It is instead baked into every single decision we make. Every time we're trying to think of a specific functionality for the device or a specific requirement, we're building that in with security in mind. I'd like to walk back a little bit from here and talk about some software terms, and that is going to be a software requirement. So a software requirement is essentially what a product needs to do. We're going to have non-functional requirements and functional requirements. The functional requirement is that what? So we're saying the device needs to has an authentication page. That authentication page takes username and password, or maybe that authentication page takes Google authentication. That would be a functional requirement. On the non-functional requirement side, we're saying this authentication page should reject any bad characters, anything that is associated with a hack. This login page shouldn't take anything longer than 80 characters. The username should be formatted like an email. The non-functional requirement is saying how something does something. So usually these are going to be built off of the functional requirements, and security requirements are part of those non-functional requirements. So moving back to how this ties into security by design, the requirement phase is typically going to be the first part of creating a product. We're going to identify the requirements for the product, so what it needs to do. Usually that's going to start with these functional requirements. Any medtech innovator is going to have an idea for what problem they're solving and how they solve that problem. That's how they're creating these requirements. We should immediately start creating cybersecurity requirements off of these. So this is part of that QMS, ensuring that we're adhering to good coding standards. And I'm going to skip down to the bottom of this slide here a little bit and talk about IEC 62304, which is the standard that dictates how secure medical devices and medical device software should be designed. We want to make sure that manufacturers, whether in-house or outsourced, are adhering to this standard and building in these cybersecurity requirements early and often. All right, now moving back up to our discussion on how we're designing in security. So it's one thing to say, oh, we've built in security. We have all these security requirements that we wrote down in our requirement specification. What's next? Well, that goes back to this risk management process that we are developing early on in the inception of the product. As we're creating our quality management system for this device, we need to make sure we have those separate yet connected security and safety risk management frameworks in place. Anytime we're identifying a potential problem within this product, we're going to feed it into these risk management approaches. So for the standard security problems that we're going to identify, those will get fed into our TIR57 security risk management. Now, I could spend hours talking about how this security risk management approach works, and we've done some recordings on this in the past. However, what I just want to talk about is that high level. We're going through the hypotheticals of what can happen, that threat modeling exercise. We're identifying risks through testing. We're assessing the risk, and then we're implementing a control. I want to talk about that testing phase a little bit when we're looking at security by design. When we're going through those hypotheticals, implementing these security requirements, that's more towards that threat modeling phase, but we need to verify all of this is in place. As we're creating a product continually, that risk management framework states that we should be continuously evaluating and continuously testing this product. So we're going to want to test these requirements to verify that they're in place and functional. We want to test the product altogether for security. We want to test the code for security. And that is going to give us the input to feed back into our risk management framework to assess each one of these findings at that risk assessment phase. Now, the reason I want to talk about this as such an important step to implement early is if we're identifying these problems early, it's going to greatly reduce the workload down the line. We're also going to have all of these artifacts already prepared. This process is in place. We have these requirements. If we're testing them early, that is a requirement for the FDA. They need to see that you have security requirement test cases that have been implemented and verified. If we're doing this continually throughout the process, the documentation load and the burden on the manufacturer is greatly reduced when the time of submission comes. Very often, cybersecurity documentation is thought of as this big, daunting hurdle to cross at the end. And it's the newest major guideline. It's at the bottom of eStar. So it makes sense that it's often left towards sort of that. It's not always at the front of mind. When we're taking this approach, everything is prepared with those artifacts already in mind. We don't have to go and retrofit cybersecurity on. We don't have to go and prepare these artifacts after the fact towards the end of the submission. We're designing the product, creating them as we go. And then when the time for submission comes, there is no panic to get everything done for cybersecurity. It's already been done. It was done since the beginning, since we had this QMS already securely in place. All right, I'd like to go over some easy cybersecurity wins. And of course, this isn't an exhaustive list, so definitely a good area that we can look at a little bit of conversation here as well. Now, I'll just go through some of these options, and these are, of course, non-exhaustive. However, these are some of the easy ones that we see on most devices. And again, this may not apply to every device, but this is in general the standard. So, threat modeling. This is something that should happen pretty early in the device lifecycle, and it should happen continually through the device lifecycle. There is a great playbook, the MITRE playbook for threat modeling medical devices, which dictates how this process should happen. Now, this is asking 4 main questions. What are we working on? What can go wrong? What are we going to do about it? And did we do a good job? These 4 questions should be the first questions asked anytime we're making a change to the device, we're adding a new functionality, we're changing an old functionality. Threat modeling should be continuous anytime we're making big shifts in the product. The next thing that I want to talk about is static application security testing. This is essentially an analysis and review of the code base to make sure that there are no vulnerabilities that get identified through poor coding habits. This is usually just an automated tool, and it's set up as part of that development pipeline. Now, from a regulatory perspective, it is a requirement under the FDA guidelines. When doing an FDA submission, it's important to have all of these different documents as far as testing ready to go. And so static testing is one of those documents that we need to have reports stating that we did the static testing. Now, the next thing is ensuring that quality documents are set up and in place before development begins, and all risk management processes are clearly outlined. The reason that this needs to be in place before development begins is to prevent any ad hoc development based on developers' individual taste. Everything should go to the standard that is being adhered to. In this case, again, that's going to be that 62304 standard. We want to make sure that every coding decision is following that same process and nothing is done as a spontaneous decision. We want to make sure that all changes are clearly documented. Everything is adhering to those initial specifications that we have created. The next thing that we're looking at is the software bill of materials. This should be generated and evaluated constantly throughout the manufacturing of the product. Now, this is going to be a requirement under IEC 62304, and I want to step back and talk a little bit about how this can vary. So this is based on the class of device. Now, The different classes of device, there can be a class 1 device, class 2 device, class 3 device. Usually we're going to be looking more at the class 2 and 3 devices in the medtech space. Class 3 devices are very high risk, with the often going to be like an implantable device, like a pacemaker. Class 2 devices are much lower risk, can be thought of like a patient monitor or an oxygen pump. Now, the requirements are going to vary pretty heavily depending on what class of device we're working with for the software bill of materials. When we're working with a class 3 device, part of the quality process that needs to be developed very early on is vendor approval and component approval for anything that enters the device. Any third-party components need to be carefully vetted if they're going to enter a class 3 device, as vulnerability can potentially be catastrophic. So the scrutiny for what components go into one of these products is going to be very high. This can go a little bit into the different types of submission as well. From a cybersecurity perspective, the submission documentation won't vary too much, but when we're looking at a class 3, that's often going to be the de novo or a PMA certification. When we're doing those PMA or de novo certifications, we still need to make sure that everything is set up. Those have a lot of scrutiny under the FDA considerations, whereas a 510K, it's assumed that'll be a little bit lower risk, and the predicate is going to act as a good example for what should be done. All right. Now, I know we talked about this a little bit more before as well, but it's very important to design security requirements early and document them well. Once these are well documented, we also have to have the test case to verify it. Again, this is an FDA requirement. Security requirement test cases are required as part of that security testing documentation that the FDA wants. Security testing can be a little bit of an ambiguous term, but in general, it means static testing, requirement testing, penetration testing, fuzz testing, vulnerability assessment. There's a lot that it covers. And so this is just one area that we need to make sure we're covering. This is one of the more common areas that I see manufacturers forget about or leave to the very end, and it's very difficult to retrofit requirements onto a product. Now, as we're going through this development process, we're assuming everything is adhering to these best practices that we should be following. Any controls that are getting implemented in the device should be clearly documented. Now, while it's a good practice to have all of this documented, all of this prepared in the quality system, it's not an explicit requirement to have these documented. So why is this an important point that I want to bring up? When we are preparing FDA documentation, they want to talk about the security control categories that they see as the most important. This is a non-exhaustive list. It covers authentication, authorization, cryptography, confidentiality, event detection and logging, and secure software update procedures. This is, again, non-exhaustive. The FDA wants to see how you are creating controls that are boosting the security of the device. Oftentimes, it's going to map very well to what the FDA already sees as some of the most important categories. And so some of these controls can go directly into that section. However, the documentation needs to be prepared and provided to the FDA. So it's important to have everything ready to go before, instead of having to go back and try to understand what these controls are in the device. The documentation should be clear and ready. All right. Now, I also wanted to look at a couple of common misconceptions. Now, we've heard all sorts of different misconceptions in the medtech space, especially around cybersecurity. The guidance isn't very concrete, and so it can be easy to misinterpret something, or sometimes the way that it says is just not the way that it's practiced. Now, this first example is going to be a perfect example of that. Oh, well, my device is not connected to the internet, therefore it's not a cyber device. The FDA's definition for cyber device is not as accurate as their practice. There are a list of and requirements, and one of them states it must have software and it must be connected to the internet. So oftentimes we'll deal with non-network devices, and the manufacturer reads that and states that, well, we don't think it's a cyber device. It doesn't connect to the internet. So they go ahead and submit without their cybersecurity documentation, and the FDA, and again, it's going to depend on the reviewer. It can depend on, manufacturer's implementation of the device, but more often than not, if it has software, the reviewer is going to kick it back, stating you need to address cybersecurity. The cybersecurity requirements will obviously be lighter. You don't have to worry about interoperability between different components if it's not a network device. You don't have to worry about maybe that multi-patient harm aspect of the device. However, there are still going to be security considerations. You still should have security requirements. You need to have static testing, fuzz testing. You need to have penetration testing against the product and all of the documentation to go along your risk management. All right, another common thing that we hear is, well, we already have a safety risk management process, so can't we use that for our security risk management process? And this is, again, an area that needs to be disconnected. We need to have a clear divide between these two processes. They blend together at times. In that risk assessment phase, you may feed one problem from one safety risk, from the safety risk management into the security risk management and vice versa. However, it can't just be one process. The FDA wants to see that we have these as clearly separated processes. Now, we'll often hear, well, our similar device a few years ago didn't have trouble during the submission, so this one probably won't either. The guidance has changed dramatically in the past 18 months. The September 2023 guidance really shook up how the medtech industry as a whole has to handle cybersecurity. It's a major consideration now, and some manufacturers just may not be familiar with the new guidance. So if they're under the assumption that it's working as it did before this latest guidance, they're going to be in for a little bit of a surprise when the FDA comes back with this massive list of the cybersecurity requirements that they didn't meet. So it's important to know that as long as you're submitting a device under the current guidance, which is any device submitted now, you have to address all of this cybersecurity. Now, another thing we'll hear is, oh, our device is very simple. It has minimal functionality. Probably doesn't need any security testing. We have identified some pretty remarkable problems on very, very minimal functionality devices. Devices with no interface, no connections. All they do is a single function as, say, an oxygen pump. One example I can bring up is we had a device that effectively acted as an oxygen pump, and it had some removable pads that needed to be replaced for safety, as if they weren't replaced very often, it was possible for them to grow mold and then them to introduce that mold into the patient, which could potentially lead to them getting a fungal infection. We identified a vulnerability in the device where when it read that pad, we could decide how many uses that pad had left, and we could set it to any arbitrary number we wanted. So we could reuse these single-use pads 10,000 times, and they would very quickly become non-sterile. If a patient were to do that, or if a hacker were to manipulate a pad to be reused and a patient wasn't warned to replace it, they might get very, very sick. So even if it's a very simple device, there can be a lot that goes wrong. Well, we can address cybersecurity documentation towards the end. Again, this is not something you want to wait to the last minute for. As you're going through the cybersecurity documentation at the end, you might realize, oh, well, we don't have our cybersecurity requirement tests, so we'll just go back and test our cybersecurity requirements. Oh, well, we didn't develop our cybersecurity requirements. We can try to add them on now. Well, this is going to take us another 6 months to try to develop the device with these requirements in mind. It's very important to try to address this early and often. And I think as an industry, the medtech space is getting better about addressing cybersecurity early, but it's still an important issue that we need to cover, and we need to make sure that manufacturers and medtech innovators are aware that this is something that has to happen early. Regulatory affairs professionals need to make sure that manufacturers are getting their documentation in line towards the start of the process instead of pushing it all the way towards the end. Another thing we'll hear is, well, we did threat modeling and testing once, so we shouldn't need it again. This is an iterative and cyclical process. You can't do it once and say it's good. It should be continuous, as the device is going to constantly evolve, and so is the threat landscape. All right, now we want to talk about submitting into eStar. So FDA guidelines don't exactly map to eStar. Can seem a little bit ambiguous too, as oftentimes they will define the same term in very different ways. For an example, interoperability is covered very differently in eStar as opposed to what the FDA guidance states. So oftentimes it can be a little bit difficult to strike that right balance. Now, of course, every manufacturer is going to prepare their documentation in a different way. It can be through a different structure. However, we recommend that documentation is prepared and submitted according to the eStar headings. eStar is structured in a way that the FDA is used to see. So if it's structured towards the FDA guidance, it's in a bit of a different format, a different order than eStar, and so the reviewer may not see everything organized exactly where they're expecting it to see. This doesn't necessarily mean that it's not there. But we've seen many different deficiency responses, or not necessarily deficiency, but requests for additional information from the FDA, where they just can't find information in the massive thousands of pages that they're provided as part of a 510K or a PMA. So making sure that everything is structured in the way the FDA is going to want to see it is going to save a lot of time and cut down on the review cycle. Now, nothing can be overlooked during submissions. If there's a heading for it in eSTAR, there's a reason it should be included. You need to have a very solid justification to omit documentation, especially cybersecurity documentation, when preparing that eSTAR submission. It's very important to cover every single item, and it can be helpful to even have a checklist in the form of all the different eSTAR headings. This is not only for cybersecurity. This is going to cover human factors testing, biocompatibility, software, labeling, making sure that every single box is ticked before you're going in to submit, or at minimum having very good justification for admitting something. Now, finally, documentation complexity should scale with the device complexity. If a device is very simple, it only does one thing, and it's a pretty low risk, it's likely the documentation is going to reflect that. There won't be a ton of documentation on cybersecurity controls, and the cybersecurity testing will be fairly brief, as there just isn't too much to test and there isn't too much to implement controls around. Inversely, large, complex systems with many interconnected components operating in a very dangerous environment is going to have a lot of different documentation requirements to ensure that it's being addressed safely. All right, I want to talk about some of the risks of pushing cybersecurity towards the end. So, of course, in the medtech space, developing a medical device is extremely expensive. On average, it costs between $2 and $5 million to create a medical device, with manufacturers typically receiving between $20 and $30 million in funding before they get approved for a 510K. So, with that in mind, there's a lot of money that needs to be accounted for, and it should be accounted for well. Cost overruns from retrofitting security can be very dangerous. The cost of hiring developers for another 6 months or a year past what was expected because there weren't security requirements built in the first place can potentially sink the ship when we're running a startup with a shoestring budget. This can also cause a delayed time to market. If we have to push back the project, then that means that we're not going to be able to sell it as quickly as we'd hoped. That is also a problem if the FDA kicks it back. If they kick it back, you're going to have to go back and make these fixes, and that's going to delay the time until you can sell your product. The FDA can also reject you based on mishandled or insufficient documentation. If you have the controls in place, but they weren't clearly documented, then the FDA they don't know what you have in place. They need to see that evidence and those artifacts properly created and given to them. If they don't have that, they're going to kick back the submission stating that they don't have evidence of these and they need to see that before they can proceed. Having that organized the first time is going to remove this risk. Now, more and more often, we're seeing venture capitalists and investors implementing cybersecurity as part of what they want to see on their roadmaps. They have seen a lot of their clients get burned by missing cybersecurity and getting rejected by the FDA, and then their product is pushed back by 6 months or 12 months, and it starts becoming an expensive problem. The investors are getting smart about this, and they want to make sure that the manufacturers are as well. They want to see cybersecurity developed as a continuous part of the roadmap, not just a single block. Now, if we go through the whole process of designing a product and we get to a final product, and we identify that there need to be some pretty major shifts based on cybersecurity, it can be difficult to implement those in a completed product. One example is Secure Boot. Secure Boot is a great way to prevent tampering on a device. However, if a device is not designed with Secure Boot from the very beginning, it's very, very difficult and takes a long time to retrofit it onto a product. So this is an example of a design choice that needs to be made at the beginning and carried through all the way through the development process. Finally, outside of having to spend more money on creating the product, you may lose money that you could have been making otherwise. If you're running into major delays, that's time that could have been spent selling this product and generating revenue. So there is a major aspect for potential lost revenue if you're running into kickbacks from the FDA or delays due to development overruns from cybersecurity. All right. I want to touch up on some of the key takeaways here based on everything that we've covered. I know we've covered a lot, so I want to try to sum it all up nicely. Regulatory affairs professionals should adhere to ISO 13485 for quality systems with medical devices. This is how we're building that quality management system. We're preparing all of our documentation, risk management policies before we get into the actual development. Safety and security risk management must be separate yet connected processes. Remember, these tie in at that risk assessment phase. We may find that a security problem has a safety impact or the other way around. Cybersecurity design should happen early. It shouldn't be pushed to the last minute. When we're trying to retrofit security on at the end, we just talked about all the different problems that can come up from doing that. So designing security in early is going to help us mitigate those issues. Device manufacturers and the ones writing the software themselves should stick to IEC 62304 for the guidelines on how to securely develop software. It's very important to make sure that you're designing safe medical software due to the fact that we're in such a dangerous and potentially life-threatening industry. So having secure code is vital. Now, finally, we want to make sure that our eSTAR submissions are handled very carefully and they're formatted to the way the FDA wants to see it. That may be different from how you store information in your internal QMS. And there's no right or wrong way, but to ease the FDA submission process, it's recommended that it is formatted the way that they're going to want to see it in the eSTAR submission portal. All right. That is all that we had to capture everything in here. I want to turn it over to you, Christian, see if you had any initial questions, then we can check in, see if there are any questions from the audience as well.
I don't have any questions. I think you did a outstanding job, or I would have jumped in earlier. You covered everything very well. Let's see if the audience has any questions. Anybody attending? Let's see. It looks like there's a question here.
All right. At what stage should RAs start setting up their QMS? This should be before any development happens in the product. So having clearly defined quality processes in place, make sure that nothing is getting designed in a dangerous way that requires going back and retrofitting it. So ideally, we want to see that at the very beginning of the process.
All right. Let's see if there's any other questions. Looks like there's another one here.
All right. Where do RAs and QAs have overlap in the process? So regulatory affairs and quality assurance are often, you'll often see like RA/QA merged into one thing. And often it is, part of the RA professional's job to make sure that quality is adhered to. Typically, we like to see that be a little bit of a more separate process. Someone is making sure that everything is meeting that regulatory specification. Someone's making sure that it meets the quality specification. So I think that there is heavy overlap in making sure that documentation is meeting the standards set out by an organization. However, with RAs, it's more driven around that, external requirement, and QA, there may be internal document quality procedures or, internal formatting requirements that need to be met. So it's a little bit more of where the source of the requirement's coming from.
Cool. Let's see if we have any other questions. I don't see any other ones yet. Looks like there's one more here.
All right. This is an interesting question. So how do cybersecurity documentation requirements change for PMA, de novo, and 510K? They don't change too much, really. 510K means that there is a predicate device. So you are saying there is a similar device already on the market that we're using as our predicate example. I would say in the metrics, when you're generating cybersecurity metrics, that means you should be using metrics from that predicate when you're preparing the documentation. As far as the testing requirements, there aren't too many distinctions. In general, there aren't too many differences between the two. Now, the complexity of documentation, of course, is just going to scale with device risk and device complexity. And typically with a PMA or a de novo, that's when we're getting more towards that riskier or more complex device. And then the documentation is just going to be more in depth because of it.
All right. I don't see any other questions. I think that's it. Any final words of wisdom, Trevor?
Make sure that you're addressing your cybersecurity early and often. Don't leave it to the last minute, and ensure that RAs are covering their quality management systems and devices early, and they are ticking all of the boxes so that they're ready for their eStar submission when the time comes.
I agree. Early and often is the way it should be done. Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Trevor. Thanks everyone for tuning in, and we'll see you next month for our next monthly webinar. Have a great one.